At this time, I'm super excited to bring up another all-star guest presenter with us with Common Cause, and she is the Redistricting and Representation Counsel for Common Cause, Suzanne Almeida. And I am really excited because she's going to talk to us about messaging. And, you know, in the era of the 24-hour news cycle, in the era of Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and sadly, in the era of disinformation campaigns, making sure that we can effectively communicate inwardly to our internal stakeholders, as well as externally about redistricting and why it's so important that we're in this process is super helpful. And so we're going to get the messaging right. Suzanne's going to help us get the right words together. And so Suzanne, thanks for being with us today on behalf of Common Cause, and I'll let you take it from here.
Amazing. Thank you so much for having me. I am so excited to be here and talking to all of you on a Sunday. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly. Give me just a second. And as I am getting this all set up, I do want to make sure that you all know that I am not a communications expert. I am an advocate who works in redistricting, right? So I use the tools and the messaging that I'm going to talk to you in my work as I'm advocating across the country, as I am working with communities, working with organizations to really educate them and help them tell their own stories. But there are people who are much smarter than me that worked very hard to pull all of this messaging together. And so I will want to make sure that we're giving a shout out to ASO Communications, as well as Frameshift and the Fair Representation in Redistricting group that really helped pull all of this together. So as Daquan said, my name is Suzanne Almeida. I'm from Common Cause. We work kind of across the country to support states on the path to fair redistricting. And we are super excited to be working in Virginia with folks like Daquan and Liz from NAACP and the League of Women Voters, as well as other organizations in the state, just to make sure that, you know, you all have a brand new hybrid commission that is just getting off the ground. And so we want to do everything we can to support that and make sure that it's going in the right direction. So today we're going to cover a few things. So best messages for encouraging people to take action on redistricting, what not to do, and we're going to start out with a little bit about telling your community's story, which you heard a lot about, both from Chris and from Michaela, about kind of the technology and then also the ways that we can testify to our community stories. I think one of the things that I want to talk about is just some of the mechanics. What are the things you want to think about in telling that story? So general tips, and you all probably know this, but I want to say it out loud anyway, just in case there's someone who's like, you know, new to the redistricting world or new to the organizing world. Make sure we're starting from the same spot. So 3 general tips. One is understand your audience, right? How much do they know about redistricting and why it's important? One of the things that we talk a lot about is how redistricting is kind of you know, that pyramid of engagement, right? And they skip several of the bottom rungs and go right to, this is important because, right? And we have to start all the way at the bottom and work our way up so people are engaged. Meet your audience where they are. Use language and examples that resonate with the people who you're talking to, right? So I live in Pennsylvania. I don't want to necessarily use Pennsylvania examples when I'm talking to a Virginia audience, right? Because you all have your own examples in state of what makes a difference. And so think through that when you're making kind of the decisions on how you're communicating with folks. And then finally, and this is just quite frankly, common courtesy, talk with people, not at people, right? We want to, we know that as advocates, our best practice is to always be in conversation with the people we are hoping to energize and engage and educate. And that means doing things like asking questions, listening to what people are saying, and then responding in a conversation. So before we jump into a lot of the messaging, I do want to highlight some things that we found out via the research that was done on behalf of the Fair Representation and Redistricting group. And that's that most people don't understand what the word redistricting means. it seems too complicated, or it seems like it is not the kind of thing that folks really can engage with. For some people who kind of have some familiarity with redistricting, they tend to think that it means the same thing as gerrymandering, right? And we know, those of us who take time out of our Sundays to talk about redistricting and organizing, that redistricting is really about just the process of drawing lines, and gerrymandering is the manipulation of that process for political or partisan or individual gain. And then finally, and this is going to kind of be a theme that I'm going to talk through in many of the pieces that we're talking to today, we need to put our communities at the center of our language, right? So thinking about ways that we are framing, even talking about the word redistricting, right? Community districting, fair districting, drawing districts, that kind of stuff really can help people understand and latch on to kind of the process of redistricting. So we want to start with telling your community's story, right? And I think both Michaela and Chris talked about the importance of making sure that your community is kind of represented. And the way to do that is really about telling the story, right? And I always think about when I am talking to someone who doesn't have a lot of familiarity with redistricting, whether that person be a member of the press, whether that person be, someone who is making comments that are not quite right on a social media network, or whether that's someone just, in my personal life, I think about telling my story as a way to connect with them and to start moving the message along, right? So again, it's similar to what Michaela said. We talk at Common Cause, we use the 3 C's, right? So culture, concerns, and count. How would you describe the people who are part of your community? What does that mean? What is the history? What are our languages? What are the values? And then concerns. What are the issues that we have that need attention from the government? Are there projects that need resources? What's our traffic like? Are our roads in disrepair? Do we have enough funding for public education? What's the air quality like? And then finally, we recommend, just kind of as an advocacy tool, that if there's data that we can present that strengthens our stories, that we should do that as well. Now, this can, I don't mean just like the decennial census data or data from the American Community Survey. I'm talking things like who lives in our community. Like, let's think about who the population is. Let's think about income levels, distance from hospitals, lack of green space, even just the number of people who live here. All of these pieces are things that can come together to really effectively tell a story. And so, just to kind of highlight again, this is important for a number of reasons, right? Not least of which is that lawmakers, or in Virginia's case, the commissioners, including lawmakers who are drawing the maps, need to hear these stories. But it's also really important in a litigation perspective for courts to consider if it comes to that. And then finally, for the media to cover. And I think that that's a really important thing to think about as we're talking about kind of launching or continuing to launch ourselves through a redistricting process. The media, through not a lot of fault of their own, has spent a lot of years covering the redistricting process from a very partisan angle, right? So it is talking about, who wins, who loses, what happens to the Democrats, what happens to the Republicans, what's going to happen, to XYZ partisan policy, what kind of political shenanigans are going to happen. And all of that is important, yes, but it's not the main story. The main story is what's happening to the people on the ground in the communities that are being divided up by the redistricting lines or the redistricting process, right? And so we want, as advocates, as organizers, to reframe some of what we're talking about so that the media can pick up and tell those stories as well. Along with that, I think the really important thing to say is, we know that concrete impacts are way more impactful than political shenanigans, right? So, again, things like education, hospitals, air quality, homelessness, flooding, traffic, all of those things, like individual impacts, are important when you're talking about why redistricting matters, right? It's very easy as advocates, and I certainly have done this, to kind of fall into this pattern of speaking where I'm talking about like redistricting matters because we want, because this line is drawn in a shape that doesn't make any sense, or because this lawmaker was drawn out of his or her district, when really that's kind of a symptom. But the actual problem is that it's going to impact the communities that are not being fairly represented, right? So just as a flag, remember to talk about impacts, like what is happening because of the redistricting in a good or a bad way, rather than kind of the symptoms, the whether the shape is pretty or whether there's a political squabble behind the whole thing. So we're going to get into a little bit of the message testing now. This is going to be just like, in fair warning, a lot of information really quickly. I promise you will get the slides and that these resources are publicly available, right? So I have pulled this from people who are way smarter than me, who have done message testing, who are communications experts. So, just know it's going to be a lot. We're going to get through it, and then you'll have the materials so you can kind of deal with them as digest as you move forward. So best practices, really focus on equity and fairness when you're talking about redistricting, right? We know that in this message testing, people responded more to messages about fairness, particularly about the distribution of resources, than messages about voting and fair representation. It's hard to tell why that is, but if you think about it, voting and representation are very amorphous concepts. Whereas if you're talking about money for schools or hospitals in your community, that is something really concrete that people can hang their hats on. Additionally, people were most passionate when you tied that equity of resources to racial, economic, and social justice, right? So you can see this meme on the right of my screen. That is an explicit tie between the segregated drinking fountains and the impacts of redistricting that have happened on the quality of education, at least looking at the outside of the buildings, right? We don't know what's happening inside, but in theory, those two schools have different resources for their students. So again, a best practice is to name or evoke race. We don't have to shy away from this. We know redistricting has historical racial implications, particularly in states like Virginia. And I think it's really important that we can name that explicitly, right? So fair redistricting is a step. It's not the only step, but it is a step towards racial justice. We want to use phrases that establish shared values or highlight the intent or impact of achieving equity. So things like, no matter what we look like or where we live, no matter our background or zip code, whatever our color or faith, background or zip code, those kind of phrases we know really resonate and can activate members of the public who are kind of already in sympathy with us. Putting it all together, I'm not going to read this to you. It's a lot of text on the screen, but you can kind of see that this sample message is putting together all of the things that we talked about. It evokes race, no matter our color, background, or zip code. It talks about specific resources, funds for schools, hospitals, and other essential services. And then it gives a little bit of kind of like, we're in this together. We are a community. We're all drawing our district lines, and evokes those shared values that we talked about. So the next piece that I want to talk about, and this is really important as we are moving a little bit away from the education part and a little bit more into advocacy, right? So we know that in order to mobilize people, they need to feel a sense of urgency. We know that redistricting is kind of a wonky process that has been historically done behind closed doors that people don't feel like a lot of ownership of, right? So in addition to just kind of crafting the way that we talk to make sure that redistricting is something that people are doing, right? It's not a process that happens. It is a process that, like, the Virginia Redistricting Commission is going to redistrict. These are legislators and citizens who are going to redistrict. We want to also create a sense of urgency, right? We need to make a reason for people to engage in this process now. And that's tricky because there's a lot going on. And so the best practices highlighted by this communications firm is really to focus on the fact that these maps that are put in place this year will be in place for 10 years, right? So that means you can see on the left, talks about a lot can change in 10 years. They have a similar example that has a smartphone, so a flip phone to an iPhone. And I think, it's important as people are thinking like, why do I spend my time and energy now on this rather than something else? And the reason is because it's going to impact 10 years. So again, simple messages, not going to read them to you, but that's kind of how we put that concept into words. Another best practice is to talk about the villains. And you see on the screen two of my personal favorite villains, Yzma and Gaston. And I want to talk about like, who are the bad actors in redistricting? Virginia, I want to, you all are a bit of a special case, right? Because your redistricting process is brand spanking new this year. You have the opportunity to start fresh. But we know that in the past, that the folks who have redistricted in Virginia have not done what they should have done, right? There has not been enough community input. They have not protected communities of interest. They have engaged in a partisan process. And so, you really want to name the bad actors in redistricting, but, and here's a tricky part, you want to name the bad actors in redistricting without using a Democrat versus Republican lens, right? You can call them partisan actors, partisan operatives, some politicians, any of those kind of phrases are fine. But we know from this research that if you make it about Democrats versus Republicans, that kind of feeds into the business as usual, politics sucks for everybody kind of mindset. And it really takes away people's energy to get engaged. Pro tip, as we're talking about kind of what the bad actors have done, is to use words that evoke cutting, right? So things like carve up, slash, divide have been really effective. So again, these are sample messages. You can see kind of how it's pulled, both of those naming the villains. These are certain politicians, and then what they're doing that is bad for our communities. You'll also notice in these messages that we are talking in the collective, right? It's not about us as individuals, it's about us as a community. And I think that that's really important as well as we move forward. Finally, so we want to also accentuate the positive. We know that if we come at people with just a negative message about how redistricting doesn't work, how the process is rigged, lines are drawn and everybody hurts from it, we have to, that's only going to get us so far, right? Like that gets people angry, but what gets people energized and actually moving forward into doing something, which is ultimately our goal, is we have to give them a feeling that they can make a difference, right? We have to talk about how this is a fresh start for Virginia. We have to talk about how what's going to happen this year is going to set the tone for the next 10 years. We have to talk about how, there's multiple, and you've heard it already today, right? Multiple opportunities to have your voice heard by the commission. Chris ended on a great slide that really talked about the sun is shining, the door is open, we can walk through that door into a better future. And I think using those kind of messages is really impactful. But we can't end on just those kind of messages without a clear call to action or information on how people can get engaged, right? So if we are talking to someone in our neighborhood, we can say, you know what, you really have the ability to impact how the lines are drawn around our community. Would you come to a community mapping session with me, right? Would you sit down, can I send you information so you can testify? Things like that, I think, are really important to think about as you're advocating, as you're educating. So putting it all together, this one I am going to read because I think it's important to hear it out loud. From the fight for civil rights to making our voices heard in record numbers this past election, when we band together across race and place, we create lasting change. But right now, power-hungry politicians are dividing our communities in an attempt to silence people based on what we look like or where we live. So let them know. When it comes to our districts, we draw the line. By joining together to speak out on fair districting, we can continue the legacy of those who fought to make this a place of liberty and justice for all, and to ensure our communities thrive for the next 10 years and the generations who follow. So it's not perfect, right? Every time you're going to get messaging, you're going to need to tweak it a little bit to make it Virginia specific. And it might not work for all situations, but you can kind of see how this particular message put all of the steps that we talked about together in one paragraph. What not to do. I don't want to spend a ton of time here because it's much more interesting to talk about positive things, but don't start with a history of gerrymandering or redistricting in Virginia, right? And that kind of goes into the second point, which is don't give people more information than they need. What is it that you're looking for from the person or organization or group of people that you're talking to, right? If you're looking to get people engaged in community mapping, they just need to know redistricting happens after, there's like a limited amount of information that they need to know to be effective in what they're doing. We can break things down into bite-sized pieces, but when we give folks the history of redistricting or the history of gerrymandering, it can be too much. And then people shut down and think, this is too complicated for me. We talked about this already, but don't talk about redistricting as a passive process. There is someone or a group of people who is actually drawing those district lines, and that's important to highlight. And don't spend too much time on partisan politics. Again, it gets into this feeling of business as usual and discourages people from getting involved. And don't focus too much on what isn't working without also providing solutions, right? So we know that if we just say, this isn't working, this is a bad plan, they are doing bad things to us, people are just going to tune out and they're just going to say, yep, that's the way the world works. I can't do anything about it. Why would I spend my time getting involved in something I can't make a difference in? But the fact is, and you all know this, that you can in fact make a difference, right? This is an opportunity, a brilliant opportunity in Virginia to set the tone for the next 10 years. And one of the benefits of being Virginia in this decade is that you are going to be an example to a number of other states in how this can work well or less well. And that will come down a lot to the way that people can get engaged as community members and as community organizations. So with that, I will stop my share and turn it back over to Daquan and Liz.